Welcome to Aspire, an I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome back to the I Have the Right To Aspire podcast. I am Alex Prout, co-founder of I Have the Right To, and I'm joined by my three student co-hosts. Aspire was created by the nonprofit I Have the Right To as a space for honest, meaningful conversations about survivor advocacy, prevention, and what it truly takes to create safer communities. This podcast is about learning together, leaning into courage, and uplifting the voices of people who show up every day to drive real, lasting change. Before we jump into our conversation with today's guests, we want to make a moment to introduce our I Have the Right To interns who will be joining us as co-hosts for this episode. So today we are thrilled to be joined by our three student co-hosts, Shreyas, Vish, and Kaiden.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Today we are jumping in with three co-hosts because of the important topic today and, the unique background and focus of our guests. So today we're joined by Peter Fisher, a research fellow at the Movember Institute of Men's Health, one of the leading global organizations dedicated to changing the face of men's health. Movember is widely known for its annual campaign, but its work goes far beyond that. The organization funds and drives research across mental health, suicide prevention, and healthy masculinity, with a strong focus on early intervention for boys and young men. Peter brings a deep research background in social psychology from UCLA, where he studied how cultural norms and identity, especially within privileged groups like men, can shift toward greater equity. At Movember, his work helps uncover how we can challenge harmful norms around masculinity, build emotional connection, and create healthier, more supportive environments for men and boys. His research spans everything from reducing sexist beliefs to increasing empathy and reshaping the social pressures that so many young men face today. Peter, welcome, and we're so happy to have you on today.
Thank you, Alex. Really excited to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
So let's dive into it. Peter, your research looks closely at how attitudes within privileged groups, particularly men, can shift toward greater equity. What first drew you to this work, and how did that lead you to Movember?
Yeah, so my research journey started, I would say, pretty early on. I was fortunate enough in high school to take part in this program called the Multicultural Scholars Program. And that was a really interesting kind of initiative started by this nonprofit called Museum Without Walls. And it paired students from my kind of suburban, affluent high school with students from a more urban, kind of less resourced high school. And together we did a year-long training program learning about the civil rights movement, including a 2-week trip to the South to visit different civil rights sites and talk with people who are involved in the movement. And that program, I joined it because I was super interested in learning more about, American history and this important kind of chapter of like social justice and civil rights. But I left learning about kind of social inequity and different dynamics at play that are still very much real in our world today, from having conversation with folks that I was paired with as part of this program. And for me, that from a young age, when I was still in high school, kind of laid bare how certain inequities in society are kind of maintained and reinforced over time, and how these dynamics have shifted to some degree historically. But also there's processes in place that kind of maintain and ensure that certain inequities kind of are kept in place. And so that was kind of a frame that, really stuck with me into college. And when I was beginning my research career, I was very interested in kind of understanding how that played out along the lines of kind of racial dynamics and also gender, in terms of kind of where the social capital is and kind of systems of power in those spaces. And specifically, my interest kind of grew around social norms, which are these kind of invisible guidelines for how we speak, behave, and act, what is acceptable in different spaces. And I was really fascinated by how social norms are contextual, which means that depending on who you're talking to, the space you're in, and your own identity, what is the right thing to do, or what you perceive as the right thing to do, can be perceived like very differently. Especially, and I was really interested about how the influence of other people is shaping what we think is okay to do, to a degree that a lot of times we might not even be aware of. Because I think, especially in American society, we're kind of raised to believe that, have your strong values and principles and, stick to them. And what that has kind of led to is this discounting of the power of the situation in shaping how we behave and kind of ultimately what happens in certain moments. And that to me was fascinating as a psychologist, somebody who's interested in kind of understanding, the triggers and levers for different behaviors and why people do things. Social norms were just a great rabbit hole to go down. And so I spent most of my graduate career studying those, and specifically looking at potential intervention approaches using social norms and providing people with different information about kind of what other people similar to them are doing and different methods for delivering that information to kind of change attitudes towards different things, including my dissertation looked at how white Americans feel it's acceptable to talk about race and topics related to race. And so that was kind of where I've been in the past. And the work I'm doing at Movember very much is built on that. In fact, my colleague, Joseph Kilgallen, is now leading up an entire research portfolio that we're calling the perception gap, which is really diving into the social norms piece and this concept of pluralistic ignorance as it plays out related to men's health. But I'll just tease that for now. I'm sure we'll dive more into that in a little bit here.
I'm very tempted to dive into it now, but I will resist that temptation. I couldn't help but sort of drift off as I always do, because I have the best job in the world with this podcast, because I'm always learning and speaking to brilliant, experts in their field. And hearing you talk about, triggers immediately made me think about the experience with my daughter and the word triggers within the context of trauma, and different responses that victims of trauma, face throughout their normal day. And I've had to learn about interventions to sort of help mitigate, the PTSD or the reaction to those triggers. And I just found it fascinating that you use the term, triggers and intervention for social norms. And that, I think, is just so critically, important. Um, and we've got three young men as co-hosts today who are sort of living in that world. I would love to pivot to you guys to just see how did you digest what Peter just said, and what went through your mind, and how did you process it, and was it something that you said, yes, I recognize?
I feel like when he was talking about like it relies on it relies on what your environment is. I feel like whatever environment you are, like reflects on what like how you have to feel about what your say is and like cultural norms. So like what he was saying as like how it changed between like ethnicity, like how he went to the South and he wrote a dissertation on white Americans, if I'm right. I feel like having to change your opinion between cultures is something just like that's not talked about, because like you could feel like they won't agree with you, or like because of past or historical like things, like you can come off as either like very disrespectful or like absolutely like ignorant to whatever like the actual whatever really happened. So I feel like yeah, I really agree with what you're talking about.
Yeah, I had a similar view as well. Like, especially with the ignorance. But yeah, it was a lot of information to process. It's pretty interesting, especially when I feel like you're talking about social norms. I can heavily agree that, a shift in environment can cause certain people to have their own opinions and different viewpoints on certain matters. And I think that can also play into more like real life aspects that we're facing, today, just as students. Uh, a lot of people tend to change, shift norms, change characters, like, uh, I guess, start to perceive things in different ways. So I think it's a really interesting thing that's, currently going on in modern society.
And Vish, I want to, ask you to go slightly deeper here. One phrase that Peter used was the power of the situation. Do you recognize in your day-to-day life now where feel like, okay, this is who I am, these are my values, but then you get put into the power of the situation, right? Where you're out in whatever social environment that you're in that might, impact or influence how you express yourself.
Yeah, that power to the situation is like a really big thing, especially for me. So, growing up, I moved around to a lot of different communities, a lot of states, all of that. So I had to tend to shift and change who I was around certain people, just to try to fit in, create that kind of power that Alex was just speaking about, and that power can be really impactful in many positive and negative ways, but it's just that that power can also, shift certain norms and some of your own values as well, which I think has happened to me, especially in the past. And you know yeah, does that answer your question, please?
Yes, and I go back to what you said on a previous podcast, Vish, about feeling the need in middle school to assert yourself, but what a negative reaction you had to that. I found that fascinating. Could you explain that a little bit in this context?
Yeah. So, especially in middle school, I tried to, since I knew I wasn't going to be moving, I knew I was going to be staying in Virginia. I really tried to make as much friends as possible. Try to be more of not cool, but try to gain or try to, assert myself, in my school, and show people who I really am. And that eventually led to me, taking power situation in a negative way, as, I asserted myself to the wrong people, which there later, affected me horribly, in the future, which I've now grown from. But yeah, did that answer your question, Mr. Alex Prout?
Yes, yes, yes. Um, and Caden, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on like what you're speaking on the cultural norms. Like I'm blessed to be able to travel a lot, and one thing that me and my family was looking at is like how different the norms are within the cultures and the society. Because it's like you can go even within our own country, just to different states. It's like it's like in different country, it's completely different. So it was interesting to hear you speak on that.
Wonderful. I think we have a question from Vish.
So, at Movember, there's a strong focus on, prevention and like early intervention, especially in young men's mental health. So I wanted to ask, from your perspective, what are the most challenging critical moments in a young man's life where, these interventions can actually like reshape how they understand masculinity as a whole?
Yeah, such a great question, Vish. Thank you. And it actually, I think you've already touched on what's one of the biggest moments like can be when you were sharing your story about like kind of your middle school experience. Middle school, from like an identity formation perspective, that is like what you were saying, kind of like trying out new ways of being and like expressing yourself and trying to fit in. that's a huge kind of like psychologically important stage in like life transition of like coming into your own identity and exploring and trying on new, self-expression, whether it's like clothes or like ways of acting or like people you want to be friends with. And for young men, that can kind of be a very difficult time because some young boys especially, might feel very constrained in the ways that they're able to express themselves because of certain societal norms around gender, right? There's this concept called the man box, and it's this idea that traditional masculine norms kind of restrict what young men especially can do and still be perceived as masculine, right? Which is still a primary concern for a lot of young men. And so I would say, there's the middle school age is really important. But what's also important about that age is to have that freedom to try these things and to fail and to, succeed and have all of the emotions that come with both of those things and to be able to process those in a way that's healthy rather than kind of pushing that down. And so there's a lot of different programs that Movember has invested in and that we're currently doing research around. I think I'll probably highlight kind of one that's current and out in the field right now, which is called Movember Game Changers. This is one that we partner with community organizations in different cities. Right now it's in Chicago and San Diego, but we're expanding to Atlanta and New York as well. Partners with community organizations that work in youth sports. And so these are kind of like youth sports leagues, basketball, soccer. And it goes in and it has a really interesting model where it's kind of like a train the trainer model where so people who graduate from this program will come back to be kind of like a coach or a mentor for kids. And the kids in these programs range from, 11 to 13 years old. And the mentors are a few years older, like 16, 15-year-olds. And what it is basically Movember has helped create this kind of programmatic set of guidelines and training around mental health and what that looks like in sport. Obviously, sport is another space where traditionally men have been able to kind of express themselves and try on kind of different identities. I know for myself, I tried a bunch of different sports in middle school when I was hilariously uncoordinated and gangly. I remember I did track and field and I would jump over the bar like cannonball style and remember thinking I was so good until I saw a video and I was like, wait, that's what I look like doing this? But that was formative for me in good and bad ways. And I'm glad I did that. But to go back to Game Changers, what that is we are, they're already doing such great work with this community of, bringing people in who have been a part of this program to train the younger folks. And Movember's created these guidelines that are basically asking questions around emotional literacy and mental health skills. And so kind of upskilling these young men in ways to deal with emotions that are part of the just everyday life, but specifically part of, playing competitive sports. Like, how do you deal with a loss? How do you deal with anger, frustration? How do you communicate with a teammate in a moment that's like very, like high stakes? How do you ask somebody what they're going through? How do you support the team, putting the team before yourself? These are kind of complex questions, and these are big picture questions, right? That don't just apply to sport, but they have like real world impacts. If you can deal with frustration and anger in a game, you can deal with it in your own personal life. And so the idea behind that program is to kind of and this is a hallmark of kind of Movember's programmatic approach more broadly, is to meet men where they are. And a lot of young men are doing, sports, after school sports and things. And so that's a great program. And that intervention is kind of, I would say, lighter touch in that it's more building on to an existing program and building in this kind of mental health education. And it's not like a preachy thing, right? It's coming from these near peers, as we call them. So people who are just a few years older who have gone through the program themselves. And so these are people that more so than, me going into a classroom, these are people that these young middle schoolers and elementary schoolers can relate to. And that's also a really important piece, right? You need to have a connection with the person who's kind of providing these messages, right? Otherwise, it can kind of come off as superficial or preachy. And so that's kind of one area. The next one I'll talk about is a really interesting one. It's coming out of our team in Australia, who's looking at kind of how young men are interacting with like digital content around what it means to be a man. And they just released this really interesting paper on TikTok and kind of classifying different categories of content from the so-called kind of manosphere, which is, I don't know, Vish, have you heard that term before? The manosphere?
No, this is the first.
Okay, so yeah, I don't want to like use jargony speak, like it gets thrown around a lot, but it's basically this idea of these kind of influencers, content creators who have made a brand of communicating ideas about a very specific kind of way of being a man, which is usually very traditional and outdated. It's kind of like you have to be rich, ripped, relentless, get, all the, yeah, I see you're saying, these guys, right, on the internet. And so this work that we're doing in Australia is kind of trying to classify the different types of content that are being produced by people like that, and how young men get kind of on-ramped into that from the algorithm, whether it's on TikTok or YouTube or other platforms, social media platforms. And one of the findings there, and this is kind of like a pre-intervention, like to understand how to, communicate to young men in these spaces, you have to understand kind of what they're looking at. And this is to my knowledge, the first of its kind of trying to map this kind of content that's coming out of the manosphere. But they found that the biggest category of videos that young men get interested in from these producers are lifestyle content. So it's things about fitness, things about dating, relationship, business success. It's very kind of innocuous topics that are then kind of used to draw people in and create engagement. And then there's more kind of harmful or maladaptive messages around, to obtain fitness, you have to go to the gym every day, ignore pain, all of these things that are not actually good for your health or for longer term outcomes across any of these kind of things that domains that they're talking about. But that for me was a really interesting finding from that work of just, I think a lot of people have a question about, like why are young people watching these videos, and like how do they get them? How do these content creators like have such massive platforms? And the answer is like fairly simple, which is that they're creating content that's answering questions that young men have, right? Which is like, how do I talk to girls? How do I get strong? How do I succeed? And so there's a vacuum that has been filled by these people, and they recognize that. And so this work that's coming out of our Australian research team, led by my colleague, Krista Fisher, is classifying that. And we're doing some interesting space working with other groups in that space to understand what are some other narratives that can kind of answer those questions in a more aspirational way rather than a way that's very constraining and restrictive.
So Peter, I want to jump in there because, I appreciate you talking about the man box and how restrictive that is. And, we utilize that in a lot of our discussions, and it is almost like a natural reaction asking young boys and boys and young men to, fill the descriptors of a quote unquote real man. Right. And a lot of that is based upon the world that they're living in, the role models that they have, not just the images from social media, but also just the structures within their own family, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of relationships with dads, grandfathers, uncles, et cetera. And, to a large extent, social media is reflective and then can take things on steroids and spread these things out. And I think it has been weaponized in a large way to, monetize, things off of, developing young people who are searching for, information. So what the image in my mind is, the problem, exists. And I know so many people are, there's so much focus on boys and young men, but the reality is the problem exists up here in the older ages, right? And unfortunately, it all funnels down onto the shoulders of young people who are just looking for, those different role models. So I love that program, the Game Changers, because you're starting, at those young ages and blowing smoke away, from TikTok and others to sort of explain what it really is. I think it's a brilliant work that you're doing in Australia. But what can be the message to people like me, and I'm old, I'm 62, but also younger, parents who are struggling. And I'd also love to get any comments from my co-hosts in terms of your experience with that, even within your own families, right? In terms of, that modeling and some confusion it might create for you.
Yeah, I'll say one thing, and then very curious to hear from the other folks. I will say another reason that these content creators from the manosphere, folks who are advancing these kind of more restrictive narratives around what it means to be a man, are successful is because they're packaging it as just do these three things to be a man or to be successful, right? They're packaging it as a very clear path and building structure around something that's very ambiguous. These questions, these very existential questions around what does it mean to be a good person or, to be a good partner. And they're just breaking it down kind of artificially so, right? Because it's like in real life, you can't just do three things to be successful in any domain. But what they're doing is they're answering the question in a way that's very exciting and engaging. And the flip side of that is a much more complicated thing, which is, embracing ambiguity and being okay with navigating these difficult kind of existential questions that involve a lot of self-reflection in terms of, what are my values? How do I express those? How do I, understand the pressures from others that are trying to get me to act against my own values? How do I build awareness around those? So these are complicated questions, and I think the narratives around those that have been successful in terms of promoting better health and better connection are things like accountability and that's like an openness. These two ideas around oh, I said that and I can see that upset you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that made you feel that way. Let me know how I can do better. Accountability for one's actions is, something that is so important. And I think kind of gets paved over by a lot of the messaging of being relentless and being, just kind of being dominant, can kind of remove that as part of the social fabric of why it's important to, connect with others, is to understand your own role and your actions and take accountability for those. And then openness is another one, which is, a lot of narratives around what it means to be a man are really overstressing kind of self-reliance and independence and being autonomous, and not having, and it's almost like seeding distrust of having close friends and romantic partners in a way that is really not how we as people are, designed. We're social beings, social connection is how we thrive. And so understanding the value of connection and open communication. And when I say open communication, that means, going beyond oh, hey, how's it going? Let's hop into, Discord and play some video games together. It's going to the next level of hey, how are you doing? I heard, you went through a breakup. You want to talk about it. It's going to the next level. And, using that empathy, help being there for others. And that can feel rewarding for people in ways that kind of cutting yourself off from others really just removes those experiences from your life. Anyway, but I'll stop now. I'm off my soapbox.
I just wanted to circle back to what you were talking to about game changers and the work you're doing with young athletes. So I'm actually a professional jiu-jitsu athlete. I compete globally. I just competed at the World Championship a couple weeks ago in California. So I think that was, I saw myself in that a little bit, how you're working with younger athletes and having mentors is really important, especially as a young athlete. I know how important mentors are, dads, obviously, but also coaches. And I had a mentor myself who was a little bit older than me. He was a competitor. And you were talking about, how the mentors were just a little bit older than the athletes. And I think especially in jiu-jitsu, mental health, obviously in any sport is difficult. But I think in a team sport, it's a little bit easier in the sense that if you lose, you kind of have other people that you could blame it on. But in jiu-jitsu, it's just you when you step on that mat, your opponent and the referee. So when you make a mistake, it's on you at the end of the day. So that was really interesting.
Thank you for that, Kaiden. Vish or Shreyas, do you have any thoughts?
As Kaiden was saying, like as a team, I feel like not just blaming them. I feel like you actually have like moral support, like or like emotional support. Like if you guys lose a game, like let's just say like in soccer, like you lose a game, like as the World Cup's going on right now, like the knockout stages happened. Like yes, yeah, there were some games that happened, like Netherlands versus Morocco. Like there was like at least like 4 people that missed a pen, or like they skied it, or the keeper saved it. I feel like they're walking back. They have their teammates coming, like holding them, like keeping their heads up. I feel like having like that moral support is so much like it's so much better. Like instead of like a mentor at that time, you have like fellow competitors. Like you have teammates that you can actually just like look up to, and like they'll help you. Like as like there's younger people in these World Cups like playing for their first time, and there's also like veterans that have been playing. So like I feel like yeah, what Kaiden was saying, I completely agree. Like being by yourself and like in like a 1-to-1 sport is gonna be so much more difficult than having like no more support and having like one mentor.
So Shreyas, sort of articulating that, which I think is a beautiful, example to put forth. How can you in your daily life, emulate that?
Right. So I feel like let's just say like I hear someone's going through something difficult, like they're about to move, or like as Peter was just saying, like they're going through a breakup or something. I feel like you can talk to them even though like you don't know them, like have like providing that moral support or like the emotional support. Like I was saying, like maybe they're like a teammate, like except like and maybe in like a school setting, like you're in lunch and you just don't have anything else to do and you finished eating, you can go up and talk to them and like provide that support that like they're longing because they're about to like either move or they're going through something difficult.
And would that be a difficult thing to do? What might be the catalyst that would sort of get you into that action mode? Would it be practice? Would it be sort of thinking about it beforehand, or in that moment? Do you think you could, step forward like that? Because it isn't the easiest thing to do, right?
Right, yeah, you should. I agree. You should have like that type of motivation, but I feel like everything that you just said, you should have at that moment. Like you should have the courage. You should have like that time. But like really, it just comes down to like how courageous you are and how much you feel, how open you are to like your emotions. So like as you're saying, like you should how open do you have to be, or how courageous you have to be. So like let's just say like the person that's happening to, that's going through a tough time, you've never spoke to them. Like I feel like that would be the hardest like thing. It's like a cocoon you have to come out of, as like you never spoken to them, you don't know them. But I feel like just giving like that one like sense of motivation that a teammate can give is just like super important. So but it is, I agree, it would be difficult if you just didn't know them at all. But I feel like it would be really positive on like it would have a positive impact on them.
Well, and that's the important thing, right, Trish? To just think for a second about what the other person will feel, knowing that they're not alone in suffering, that
Yeah.
someone else is there, with them. And I think that's such a beautiful thought to sort of say, put yourself in the other person's shoes, and how would it feel to have someone reach out? Um, and Vish, I'm sorry to sort of constantly refer back to a previous discussion, but I was so touched about, the conversation on a previous podcast about your relationship with your dad and how that, evolved, right? And I thought it was a beautiful example of learning that can happen, on both sides when, connection happens.
Uh, Yeah, so I guess earlier in my life, me and my dad didn't have, I guess the closest relationship. It was more that, he did his own thing, I did my own thing, and he really didn't like to speak about his emotions a lot. So, as a kid, learning from like older role model, I actually tended to absorb that type of behavior and never question, what real masculinity is, because at the time it really wasn't. So, later in my life, certain events happened. So it was my dad's father's passing that, I decided to, take initiative and, really, really notice, that he struggles too, because that was probably the first time I've seen him cry in my life. And from there on, I tried to like you said, you don't make that small talk, like, hey, how's your day going? I really, sat next to him and I just had like a long conversation. I gave him a hug, and then, from there on, that small talk more later evolved to, these long chats and, conversations and, going outside, going on hikes, going fishing that we have today. And, that really reshaped our bond. Um, but, to go beyond that, on having mentors, like I didn't really have a mentor growing up, but, the fact that just the importance of having like a mentor, especially in like a sports aspect like Kaiden, or maybe in something else, maybe like a digital environment, or something that you're passionate about. I think it's really important. Like they were referring to the World Cup and mixed martial arts. Just that the fact that you have a support system is I think can really impact a young man, or even any man's mental health. And going on to your stuff about I believe the manosphere, I think that you know that these young men are negatively getting impacted from this algorithm, because you have guys like Andrew Tate, or Ashton Hall, really using their autonomy on us, talking about what is a man truly like, when it's not, because at the end of the day, you are your own man. You build yourself. So I feel like that engagement that they're creating, although it's generating all these views and media, is really psychologically impactful in a negative manner. And studies that I've done for school, not outside of stuff, really showed that, you know, external media shown to young adolescents can really be harmful to them, especially, growing up, because it changes a lot of perspectives and, can shift their opinions on certain matters as well. So, yeah.
Oh, wonderful. And Shreyas, I think you have a question.
Yeah, so just building off what Vish said, so like going back to the manosphere. So, how you mentioned the manosphere, how do you think the traditional ideas of masculinity like really affect the way that boys navigate school, like, emotionally and socially?
Yeah, such great observations and reflections. Everything, Kate in the story about jujitsu and Shreyas. I also caught that moment. I was watching the Netherlands. Oh my God, who were they playing?
Morocco.
Morocco, that they just lost to in pens. But I watched one of the Netherlands players like miss a free kick, and then he was walking back and his teammates kind of lifted his chin up, and I'm like, that's so powerful, because that's like the biggest like stage, and like the biggest moment on the biggest stage, and to still be there for a teammate when it would be so easy to just be like, oh man, you blew it, like the team, you let down the team, to be like, no, like I'm here for you, and to show that support is like, and to have that at the World Cup and like broadcast globally to a huge audience was like, that got me excited. So I'm glad that you caught that moment as well. And Vish, yeah, your observations about the manosphere. I'm glad you're also doing your own research on that. That's fun. But yeah, Shreyas, to your question, it's so important. I think in terms of context, the school setting is really where a lot of this figuring out what is the right way to be a person or a guy kind of happens, right? Where it's where all the kind of social or most of the social connection in young people's lives is happening, is in school, or like extracurriculars that are tied to school. So the way we see it from Movember is a couple of things. I think, what we're seeing is that in terms of young men who are engaging with the manosphere content regularly, which is to say that they are, watching at least an hour of videos from like people in those spaces advancing those ideas, we're seeing that they're reporting higher rates of confidence in the future and for themselves, but that comes with higher rates of loneliness and isolation and anxiety. And so it's taking a toll on their mental health. For basically, there's a trade-off happening where these young men are getting answers to these questions and feeling like they have a path forward and that's clear, but that is not actually helping their mental health. And so it's a really interesting kind of contradiction of obtaining certainty from this content, but doing so paying the price of your own mental health. And that comes from a different ways. We have follow-up research looking at, what exactly is leading to that poor mental health. But I mean, if you look at what these messages are around not having close social ties, being completely self-reliant, it's things that are literally impossible to do and still be a functioning person, right? Like, to have connection is so important, and to be able to express your emotions, to be able to have outlets beyond anger, and things like that. And so, that is one thing we're seeing from people who are engaging with that content. But Shreyas, I do want to go back to your point about kind of what we're looking at in kind of young men in schools. And what we're seeing, and I can speak to this because we actually just did a series of focus groups for this new tool that we're developing. And we partnered with the International Boys School Coalition, and we went to 6 different schools all over the world. So we went to 1 in the UK, 2 in the US, 2 in Australia. And what we were asking them about was just kind of, what are the messages around health that you're understanding? And like, we were showing them some of the new kind of parts of this tool that we're, building to measure like healthy ways of navigating the contemporary pressures of manhood. And what it did is it opened up all these really interesting kind of personal narratives about, an item as simple as, like, I let my friends see when I'm struggling. And we were like, does this feel relevant to you? Does this feel clear? And it started these really interesting conversations with these young men where they were like, I was in class and I was failing, and a friend saw me and he checked in on me. And like, that was like the one thing that like led to me passing that class, was him like checking in on me. And, these like stories of resilience that were coming through from this, like almost completely unprompted, right? Like, these are very high level questions designed to kind of get a broad sense of how people are navigating different domains of health. And it was leading to these really rich conversations. And so I think from my perspective, anecdotally, from just the focus groups that we've been doing, is that a lot of young men are very plugged in. They're very attuned to these pressures that they're facing and kind of want to have agency around choosing what is the healthy thing to do. And I think there's frustration from a lot of young men about not having clearer paths towards what those healthy things are, and especially not getting them that information in schools necessarily, right? There's no class on how to be a guy, right? And so it can be hard then and it's like understandable that a lot of young men are turning to the internet or AI to, start to ask those questions. And I will say, Shreyas, the school setting is so powerful because it provides a source of connection. It provides a structured environment, right, where you can do sports, you can do clubs. But ultimately, it's still kind of a blank slate. And what these young men take into that space and kind of how they feel that they can navigate it is really going to be the biggest factor there. And so there's a lot of, work that we're doing to understand, going back to kind of Vish's earlier comment about like interventions, like how do we help kind of young men take advantage of the resources and potential for social connection that is available in these school settings. And so that's like a lot of what we're thinking about right now. But I mean, yeah, the school setting, you think about, you spend 8-9 hours a day there. That's got to be the most important space that you're in, right outside of the home. And so, I think there's a lot. And the last point I'll make here is that there's a lot of kind of historically kind of negative views around like the locker room and like these all male spaces, for, fostering and promoting certain kind of harmful views, especially around like misogyny, objectifying women and things. And historically, that has been part of how guys connect with each other, is by creating kind of this other that they can make fun of or talk about in certain ways that creates a feeling of belonging within groups that are guys. And I think more and more we're seeing that young men are kind of choosing to reject that idea of needing to kind of shame or harass or, objectify other people to feel a sense of connection. And they're looking for ways of creating connection that feel better, and they're expressing that. And so that's another thing that we've been seeing that we're very interested in following up with.
Great. And I think Kaiden has a question now as well.
Yeah, so Movember's published research showing that young men want deeper emotional connections, but they feel constrained by social norms. Why do you think that gap exists between what boys feel and what they express?
Yeah, so now we've come full circle. We're coming back to this kind of perception gap. And so let me explain what that is a little bit to kind of frame my answer to your question. And so the perception gap is this idea that, there's kind of this expectation or this perception of how we feel that others think we should be acting or what we should be saying and believing, right? And a lot of men, especially young men, think that they overestimate the extent to which they think they need to be tough, self-reliant, and emotionally kind of restrained. And they think that people want that for them more than people actually do. And that's a misperception, right? Because now you're operating under the idea that you need to be a certain way, when in reality, that's not what anybody thinks, right? But it's really common. And it's this idea that it creates this kind of, not to use too fancy language, but like a social cognitive barrier, right? Which is this idea that men themselves want to endorse these kind of healthier, more, progressive values. But then they are worried about how that will be perceived by others because they assume that others don't feel the same way, when in fact, most of the other people actually do feel that way. And so our work in this space is really trying to identify how these misperceptions take root, like where they come from, how they vary across different contexts. So we talked about school, we talked about locker rooms, the home, right? Because the information about what is acceptable or what is expected of you is communicated by many different sources, including, it can be your dad, it can be the cool guy at school, it could be a teacher, it could also just be a movie star, it could be across 10 movies you've watched, the male lead always does this one thing, and then you are interpreting that as like, that's how I need to be as a guy, right? So it comes from many different sources. It's not just one thing, which is why it's tricky, right? It's not as simple as being like, oh, just interpret this one piece of information differently, right? It's like that information is coming from all over. And so what we want to understand better about that is, there's these misperceptions are coming about for a reason. So how do we correct that? How do we do that in a way that is building agency and not being like, you're wrong about this, but trying to show that like, actually you're right about the way that you want to be expressing yourself, but you're overestimating what other people think in terms of not letting you express that. And so we're playing around with different ways to kind of convey that information, because it can be hard. And I think a lot of guys have a hard time, reflecting on what it is that's preventing them from doing that in certain moments. So sometimes it might even just be giving that moment of reflection to be like, why are you doing this way? Is that really how other people think? And so there's a lot of different moments where there's potential to kind of interrupt that misperception. And a lot of those moments just kind of pass by, and then the misperception keeps building. And so it's kind of identifying what are those moments, and also understanding what is the right kind of message to be giving people in those moments that's both empowering, making you feel like you can act on it, and also not alienating, not telling you that you're wrong or that you are acting weirdly. But it's kind of like, how do we build people up and then get them to kind of train themselves to be more aware around these misperceptions to avoid them from happening in the future. So that's kind of the work we're doing in that space.
And that is amazing, Peter. And that gets me to this concept, which I've been dying to get into, which is pluralistic ignorance. And I would love to hear, you describe what that means.
Yeah, of course. Happy to go deep on pluralistic ignorance, which is a mouthful. But basically that concept is similar to what, Kaiden was just asking about. It's this idea that if there's, you ask a group of 10 guys how many think that it's okay to, cry in front of other people. They might think like, well, I believe that it is, but I know that most people don't think that. And so they might say like, 8 out of 10 guys in this room would say, well, that's not okay to do. But then when you actually go around and each of them says it individually, turns out 9 out of 10 think that actually is okay to do, right? And then that, in a nutshell, is pluralistic ignorance. It's this idea that the kind of perception of what others are thinking is just not aligned with the reality of what the norm is. And so it's a norm misperception. And this can manifest in many different ways. I think one of the ways that it is taught in like Introduction to Psychology is kind of this bystander effect. And that is where somebody, you could be on like a crowded train station and somebody falls down, and you look around to kind of see what is the right thing to do. And the descriptive norm, that is the information that you're being shown, is a bunch of people just kind of like standing there. And so you're like, oh, I guess this is the right thing to do because this is a weird situation. And then everybody else is just standing around. When in reality, everybody in that moment is being like, oh my God, I need to do something. What is everybody else doing? And then the social norm that's created in that moment is like nobody's doing anything because everybody's looking at each other. So I guess the right thing to do is to just not do anything. And that's a norm misperception as well, right? And then to cut through that in those moments, what they say is, to spring into action, to like clearly identify like, hey, call 911. And that is the way to do it, is like in those moments to disrupt a descriptive norm that's not representative or not adaptive, right, of helping others, is to take action that like clearly demonstrates what the norm should be. That's like a very concrete situation where like a real world emergency, and how pluralistic ignorance can kind of like prevent people from helping. When it comes to gender norms and around masculinity, it's a little more complicated. I think there's like a compounding factor of masculine norms where traditionally it hasn't been acceptable for young men and adult men to kind of talk about difficulties, express emotions, to have, sincere conversations around things that are bothering them, because those things are contrary to traditional masculine norms of self-reliance, not showing weakness, of being strong. And so those are kind of norms that, like I mentioned earlier, that information is communicated to us in many different ways. You watch a Clint Eastwood movie, he's not opening up about his emotions, right? He's shooting people and not showing a single emotion. And so, over time, you kind of absorb this through osmosis at the cultural level, and then more directly through interpersonal kind of conversations that are shaped by, it could be a coach, it could be a dad, and those, it could be a mentor, it could be a friend, those kind of reactions to how you want to disclose emotions or like have these things, the reactions of other people are the information that you use to update what is normative, right? And it only takes one person to be like, hey, boys don't cry. And then all of a sudden that's like the norm in your mind, right? And then that might not be reflected on or like examined deeply for a long period of time, right? That might just be taken as like, oh, this was told to me, I assume this is how most other people feel, even though it's not how I want to feel. And that's pluralistic ignorance. And so it's really harmful when it comes to health, right? Because we're talking about things that are directly contrary to health behaviors of being in touch with your emotions, being able to process kind of negative emotions in a healthy way rather than ruminating or like, thinking about them all the time, or having unhealthy outlets, like aggression and things. And also help seeking, being able to admit like, hey, I'm hurting right now, physically or mentally or emotionally, and being able to reach out to friends or to go to, professionals, to a healthcare provider, right? And so across the board, this kind of perception gap of masculine norms as it pertains to health is something that is like widely documented, but not super well understood in terms of, again, what the levers are for changing perceptions and kind of understanding interventions to disrupt this cycle. So that's something that is fully within our sights right here now at Movember. My colleague Joseph Kilgown is just launching into some focus groups, and we have like a year-long research project planned to get some answers in that space.
Wow. And so, I love the fact, my oldest daughter, Lucy, is a PhD student at NYU and focused on restorative justice. So my learning curve, it's unbelievable having a research, resource within the family circle. And it's been supremely educational. I'm looking forward to diving into all of this, Peter. But in our own way, through our discussions, we are also so aligned with that thinking. And we've put the phraseology a little bit differently. My other co-host from last year who helped start this podcast, a high school student in New York City, he brilliantly discussed the concept of what boys face every day as every day he has to swallow a little pebble. He sees a situation where he knows, hey, I should probably support this person or speak up and say that's wrong or step in and help someone. But, now I have a word for it, that pluralistic ignorance is a pressure on the shoulders to swallow that little pebble. And what I found interesting about the way he described it is when you swallow a little pebble, it is easy to digest. You can say, I can do this. It's not that big of a deal. But then these pebbles, accumulate on your inside. And I have the right to, when we speak to boys and young men, I ask them to identify what are the three, sort of core values that exist in your inner core that sort of define, who you are and that you can remember from the time you have memories. And typically the answers are like caring, supportive, loving, funny, kind, whatever, the descriptors are. But, in our thinking, you're in these situations, if you're thinking of it from a plumbing perspective, if your eyes and ears and brain are absorbing information around you, and they need to go on that lightning quick journey down to your core to connect with how should I, as my own individual human being, and Vish, as you said, of being your own man, right? How do you get there? If you think you swallow pebbles every day and they accumulate, you can't do that journey. And I think that's what we see with so many, older people and younger people. And it's almost, the way we describe it is needing to build that muscle memory of saying, thinking about it beforehand. Vish, Shreyas, Kaiden, you guys spend thousands of hours in academics. And why do you do that? It's practice for performing in a stress environment of a test. Reality, right? In terms of your role as a student. And as athletes, you spend hundreds of hours practicing building that muscle memory to perform in a match, setting, right? Where everyone is watching and pressure's on you. But you have that muscle memory to fall back on. When we're asking our boys and young men to go out into the world, we're setting these unrealistic expectations and we're not ever practicing, hey, how would I act in this situation where I need to step up and do the right thing? And I'm so grateful now to have a more descriptive word, pluralistic ignorance, to go out and talk, because then if we can identify it, then we can address it. And I would love in our last couple of minutes, because we've gone way over time, but if Peter, in a short amount of time, if you could describe how can we address it? We've named it, we've identified it. What can be something that you can leave our audience in terms of what, either as a boy or a young man, or me as an older person, what can we do to address that concept of pluralistic ignorance?
It's a great question. And, that's why we're doing this, new research project that's specifically focused on fleshing out those answers. I can say what works from the literature that we've seen And specifically for the audience of I Have the Right To, I think this is interesting. And there's work on kind of the allyship space. So like men standing up for women in different settings. What we have seen that works is just correcting the misperception. So providing information about, and there's many different ways to do this, but it's the idea of like, you may have like a preformed idea or assumption around what others think. Here's hard data that's showing a different story. And it's like, what are you going to do with this data? Are you going to like update your belief and change your behaviors? And most people do. Most people do because what they personally believe and what they want to do is more in line with what the real data is showing. And so that's not a hard thing, right? Of just having accurate information, but it's also finding windows for presenting that information to people in a way that feels aligned with what they want to get out of it, right? You can't just, start a class when somebody's new to a new school and nobody doesn't know anybody. And it's like, here's like, you're wrong about this. Here's the right way to do it. It's like, you have to find the moments and like understand where people are in their journey and like kind of understand these things. And, but what we've seen when you present information in a way that is attuned, that people are receptive to, that's kind of correcting this overestimation of these norms or this norm misperception, what we've seen is that people, basically the bar for engaging in these healthier behaviors and overcoming that normative barrier, it gets lower, right? And that's great. And that's what we want. And what that looks like for men's health promotion is more guys going to the doctor, is more guys talking to their friends, more guys thinking to check in on their friends. These very kind of basic behaviors that the norm misperception is putting the bar up here for sending that text to be like, hey man, heard you were having a hard time, or like, just wanted to see how you're doing. It moves that bar from here to here, right? And it makes it that much easier to engage in those behaviors. And so when interventions and messaging and communication that corrects these norm misperceptions is presented effectively, that's kind of the goal. And so what we're doing at Movember right now is really trying to dial in what that looks like at scale, right? Because Movember, we're across 6 countries and presence in 50, do a lot of health message promotion, right? And this is really important to us, is to find messages that work at the public health level. What is a message that the UN can take, and present at a policy level, all the way down to, what is something that a teacher can do at a school? What is something that a mentor can do in an after-school sports program? And sometimes what's really interesting is that the more personal the information and the closer the message source to you as an individual. When I say message source, I mean like the person who's providing this information. If there's somebody who's trusted, like a dad, a coach, a good friend, that information really sticks in ways that, a PSA or, a talking head on TV, it might not have the same stickiness in terms of actually correcting the norm. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're at with this. So much work more to come. And it's been awesome having this conversation with Vish, Kaiden, Shreyas, like such thoughtful observations and questions. And it's really, for me, affirming that you all are thinking about this and have such great, thoughts. And just really grateful for this space and having this conversation.
Well, the gratitude goes right back at you, Peter, for what you've dedicated your life to. It is quite meaningful to us. We obviously all know of this wonderful organization, Movember, and the great work that's done, but it's absolutely wonderful to meet someone who's from within it, and seeing why the organization is great and the dedication and the brain power that's addressing this important topic. Because, before we can be allies, before we can do the right thing, we all need to know who we are. On a recent podcast, we addressed the question of who am I? And I would, put out there that most men would have a lot of difficulty with that question, because there's the performative side, there's the mask side that we need to put on or we feel we need to put on every day, versus the vulnerable, emotional, human side of us. and which seems scary to most boys and men. And the work that you're doing to address this mental health side is really what is going to move the needle in terms of the core of helping men overcome the obstacles I think we've put in our own place. And the positive thing that I've seen through working with these young men is the potential, because we've created it, we can address it and fix it. And grateful for you and Movember for providing the tools and the forums for us to sort of sort that mess out. Now, Peter, we have a tradition on the podcast where we ask each one of our guests to complete something that my daughter Chessie came up with, 10 years ago when she wanted to change the world in terms of how victims of gender-based violence were treated. And she came out with the concept of I have the right to statements. And it was a powerful tool of empowerment and healing, for my daughter and tens of thousands of other, survivors. But in the context of men, right, I think the statement has another power too. Would love for you to come up with your own I have the right to statement as we close out today's podcast.
Wow, that's such a great tradition. I think, something that I've been feeling is, well, I'll just say it. My statement is I have the right to feel. And I want to say that because I think a lot of guys internalize this kind of old, outdated norm of any kind of emotion outside of a few are not okay. But that's not how it works. Emotions are part of our experience, and you have to give yourself permission to feel empathy, to feel connection, to feel joy, and those are what life is all about. And so, yeah, I would say I have the right to feel.
I love it. I love it. I've got goosebumps from that, especially how you continued that sentence with all those other wonderful descriptors, because I hear those words and I smile, right? And I want to aspire to those emotions and feelings. And it is apropos that we say, I have the right to, because it almost feels like, we're trapped as boys and young men, and we need to break out. And it's almost like we want to declare we have the right to feel this way. But that means obviously someone is telling us that we can't, right? And the beauty of your research in pluralistic ignorance is we all feel that way. Right. So finding the ways for us to find that commonality amongst all of us, that seems really doable. So thank you for leaving me with a very optimistic feeling today, Peter. And hopefully my co-hosts feel that, same positivity going forward, because this is really going to impact you guys the most, because you have, the vast majority of your lives ahead of you, and you do have the power to bring about that change. So any last words from my co-hosts?
Just thank you for being here and talking to us about like all of the masculinities that you've been working on.
Peter, thank you so much for being part of this conversation and for the work you're doing with Movember to transform how we understand and support men's health. Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.